Welcome to this talk about the development of Killester. I'm Ruth McManus from the School of History and Geography in Dublin City University. I'm going to be talking to you about the story of Killester, including the house and domain, from our earliest recorded information in the 12th century right up until the destruction of the house in 1920. Killester's house was sited roughly where the modern-day Legion Hall is located, in the middle of Killester itself, in an area that's surrounded in the present day by housing estates. But in fact, it has a very interesting history, which we can trace back to the 12th century. So in this talk, I'm going to talk about the name Killester, where it came from, the earliest historic evidence for this location, the various owners of Killester through time, and particularly focusing then on the development of Killester House, the various owners of that building, and how it evolved into the 19th century and right through until its ultimate destruction in 1920. So to begin with, I'm going to talk about the name itself, the name Killester. And in fact, there is a lot of variation in how the name was used from its earliest recorded usage in 1178 up until the present day. And it's not until about the 1500s that we see the variation Killester as being the most common usage. That's sort of when it stabilizes as Killester. The place name Kill we know quite well as relating to a church, but the second part of the name, perhaps it's Asra or Esra or Killastra. There are various St. Lasara is suggested by the Ordnance Survey name books. So we're not quite sure of the second part of the name. And later, of course, this area was dedicated to St. Bridget, so that earlier saint's name has been lost. Interestingly, in folklore, there is a rather unlikely explanation recorded for how Killester got its name. And this is from the 1930s, when the folklore collection was being established, and every school child in the country was asked to record local folklore. And Grania here, who was at school in Raheny but was living in Abbeyfield at the time, got this story about how Cromwell executing local nuns or in the convent at Killester, and one of the nuns being chased and the soldiers running after her saying, "Killester." Of course, there's not much likelihood that this is in any way true, but it's interesting because it's this story about there being a convent and that there were nuns here is something that we don't really have evidence for in the documentary record, and yet it's a very strong story in folklore. We'll come back to that later. Some of the earliest evidence of Killester comes from documentary legal documents, and charters like this one here, which is somewhat later, were created from the 12th century onwards. And some of these very early documents survived in the possession of the Lords of Howth and then were passed on to the National Library of Ireland. So we're very fortunate to have these documents to look to. Charters were really quite new in the 12th century, and they tell us who owned what, and they're very useful for giving a sense of what ownership was like at this time. We know that much of County Dublin was actually in the ownership of the Archbishop of Dublin and various other monastic houses. And the Priory of Holy Trinity, which is Christ Church Cathedral, and had been founded in 1038 by King Sitric. It was one of the most powerful and had the greatest possessions at this time. So Killester was owned by the Priory of the Holy Trinity, as were Glasnevin, Raheny, and Clonturk, which is modern-day Drumcondra. But it wasn't the only monastery which had possessions in the area, because Kilbarrack and Donnycarney were owned by St. Mary's Abbey, which had been founded about 948. But as you can see from this map, the Priory of the Holy Trinity owned a vast amount of land. So all of this blue on the map represents ecclesiastical land, land that was owned by religious houses. And we know that the Holy Trinity was the wealthiest of all of these, holding over 10,000 acres of property just in County Dublin, and it had possessions in other parts of the country too. Now we know that from a series of charters that the prior of Christ Church Cathedral had been Lord of Killester, described as Lord of Killester, from before the Anglo-Normans arrived. And then one of these new arrivals, William Brunn, was granted possession of the land. And he had to pay a half an ounce of gold and a pair of boots for the prior on the altar of the Holy Trinity every year. And that was his rent for the land. We know from some studies on these early charters that William Brunn, his wife Suzanne, and his son Audion and daughters Alice and Suzanne probably lived here in Killester. There is a history of Killester parish which claims that there was a substantial motte and bailey, so that's a sort of an earthen rampart and ditch surrounding this artificial hill. It was a form of defense that was very common at this time. And he has suggested that this would have been where they lived and that this actually survived until the late 1920s. So there is a suggestion then of this possible defensive structure here at Killester. It is marked on a map suggesting the distribution of mottes and other earthworks of this nature in the Dublin region in the medieval period. We don't actually know for sure. It's not conclusive that this was the case. There aren't very many of these motte and baileys in the immediate hinterland of Dublin, and that means that it's quite interesting if it did exist here in Killester. It's the only known example of a motte on church lands in Dublin. And maybe suggesting the fact that such defensive structures were needed, we do know that Brunn himself was murdered in 1199. So if Killester was a manorial centre, then it was where the Lord of the Manor would have lived. There would have been some sort of a parish church here. There would have been some houses and various agricultural buildings as well. So this is a sort of a representation of what a medieval manor would have looked like. So that and up in the top right there, you can see a later map for Killester, but it seems to show this clustering of buildings in the location. Now, if we talk a little bit about the church, because we have this question about the origins of the name and the fact that we have this name Kill, there were almost 300 of these medieval churches in Dublin. Already in the 17th century, this was being described as decayed. The archaeology shows that there's a rectangular building which existed at the centre of the graveyard on the north side of Killester Avenue in the modern day, unroofed for a very long time, and possibly still standing as late as 1838. So it is somewhat confusing exactly the story of this building, but it was a very plain building in the various descriptions that we have of it. Somewhat similar to Kilbarrack Church or the church at Grange Abbey in Donamead. And again, the use of the word abbey in relation to the Donamead Church is sort of interesting because a lot of sites or ruins got embellished with the name abbey, and they may not have had a physical abbey there at any particular time. So perhaps this is where we get the name Abbeyfield and the Nuns' Walk. It's not entirely certain that there ever was an abbey as such here. To return to the Lords of the Manor then, we know that the manorial centre would have been close to this parish church if the sites of the ruined church and the mansion house that we have later on were persistent. And we know a little bit about the various owners through time. So the land came into the possession of the Brun family, as we have seen, and we know 5 shillings was being received for the rental for the whole year in 1343 by the Priory of Christchurch. But at some stage, at least by the 14th century, we know that the White family was in possession of Killester. So again, we have some names and various documentation which gives us this information. And we know then at about 1459, Alice White, who was the daughter of Nicholas White of Killester, married one Robert St. Lawrence, who was the 15th Baron of Howth. And through this marriage, the lands and manor of Killester came into the possession of the Howth family. And it's thought that the Lord of Howth actually lived in Killester at this time. So again, we have various pieces of documentation that refer to the St. Lawrence family holding this land and making payments to it and leasing it out to others over time. It is said, indeed, that Nicholas St. Lawrence, who was the son of Robert and Alice, in the Book of Howth, it's described how he is said to have entertained James Butler at his mother's house in Killester in 1492. And at this time, there had been a lot of disharmony, shall we say, between the Geraldines and the Butlers. But they had reconciled. So there's a famous story of how Sir James Butler and the Earl of Kildare had shaken hands through an opening in the closed door of St. Patrick's Cathedral. You know, that whole story about chancing an arm. But at this dinner in Killester, Nicholas St. Lawrence apparently was unhappy with something that Butler had said about the Earl of Kildare and threatened to take the two of them off to the island of Clontarf and to have some sort of a duel to settle the matter. But Butler didn't accept the challenge and reportedly left in a fury. So that's one of the tales associated with this early house at Killester. We know also a little bit about these various lords of Howth either using the lands directly and living here, or some members of the family living here, but at other times and more often probably leasing it to private or to other individuals, like this bottom piece from a 1593 lease, which shows Patrick Taylor from Coolock or Cowlock occupying the lands there. If we move forward a little bit, we can see that the very first maps which show us or which depict the lands of Killester date from the 17th century. So we had a very turbulent period of history from when Patrick Taylor first gets his land for 61 years in the 1590s. We had the 9 Years' War from 1594. There was intolerance increasingly of religions, and a further 11 years of war beginning with 1641 rebellion and the Cromwellian period. And whether or not the fields of Killester were directly impacted, one of the legacies of this very unsettled era was a detailed documentation of the lands of Ireland. And that was largely for the purposes of confiscating lands from Catholics and redistributing it to new British settlers, and also to pay creditors who had funded the wars. And although Killester remained within the hands of the St. Lawrence family, these records do give us a very useful picture of the area in the mid-17th century. The Civil Survey recorded the ownership of land as it had been prior to the 1641 rebellion, and it identifies all of the owners by name. So this is from the Down Survey about 1658, and underneath fingers there, hopefully you can see the name Killester, Killester depicted. So the Civil Survey then is a written record of the ownership prior to 1641, and it gives us some very useful information that we had the owners of the parish of Killester, that's the civil parish as it was then, were the Lords Baron of Howth. We know that that amounted to 186 acres, and it was valued at £90 by the time that the survey was undertaken. And it also tells us a little bit about the use to which the land was being put at that time. So we know that this was mostly arable land, there was some meadow and a very small amount of pasture. It also tells us that there was a fair stone house, a slated building, and then there were various other out offices or barns and various other smaller buildings and a stone bawn. So remember that idea of an enclosure. And it had quite a high valuation too. So we could conjecture at least that the stone house with the bawn was on the site of the original motte and bailey. The document also refers to the walls of a decayed chapel and 2 or 3 thatched cottages. We know also that although the tithes, the parish tithes or taxes belonged to Christ Church, they were in lease at this time to Viscount Moore. None of the land was being redistributed here. It was all being retained because the Barons of Howth were staunchly Protestant and could be relied upon in troubled times. So that is the story, roughly speaking, at the 17th century. So we're going to now turn to look at the development of the modern house, the later house, and try and understand its evolution through time. So we've seen the 17th century map of Killester, simply showing the name Killester. But moving forward a century, our Roke map from 1757 gives us a much more detailed explanation or information about what Killester was like at that time. And this map is really of extraordinarily good quality, and we can zoom right in, as you shall see in a moment. But just the red spot on that map there shows us how remote Killester was, out in the countryside, well away from Dublin town, which you can see down in your bottom left of the map. So when we zoom in, however, we start to get a little bit of a picture of what Killester would actually have been like in the mid-18th century. So we can see that there is a cluster of buildings. There's quite a higgledy-piggledy kind of road network. But we have the church in ruins. We have various gardens that seem to be laid out in some sort of a formal fashion. And we have Furry Park marked. We also have the Black Quarry. And over on the left-hand side, we can see a north-south running road, which is what will become the Malahide Road eventually. So looking a little bit more at some of these details in a moment. But to begin with, let's talk about Killester House itself. So here on Roke's map, we've zoomed right in, and in the center of the map, we can see a little black square representing the house, and there's some sort of an entryway, sort of a semicircular entryway, excuse me, into the dwelling. So that's quite an impressive dwelling compared to the other little black squares that we would have seen. Oh, sorry, excuse me. If we move back to the original map here. And you can also see that there are lots and lots of fields around enclosed by trees. This is one of the few images that we have of what the mansion house at Killester would have looked like. And it's already decaying at the time that this picture was drawn in 1907. You can see that some of the roof tiles are missing. So it's past its prime at the time of this particular image. It was a single-story house, as you can see, with a high sloping roof and dormer windows. And we don't know a huge amount about it, but we do think that it was built in the early 18th century. Maurice Craig, famous architectural historian, describes it as an unusually beautiful, small, early 18th century single-story house with a timber cornice, a steep roof with dormers, a central pediment, and Venetian windows in the salient end pavilions. So they're the fancy windows that you can see at either end of the building. Rolf Lober attributed the design of the house to Thomas Berg because he says that it was built for his colleague Chidley Coote. Now, there were a number of generations of the Coote family with the same name, Chidley Coote, but based on the years of activity, the Chidley Coote in question is likely the person who was born in Kilmallock in about 1644 and died in about 1703, and he had been an MP for Kilmallock. But his connection with Killester needs to be established. We do know, though, that this man's father, who was a Colonel Chidley Coote and husband of Anne Phillips, he's thought to have been born about 1608 at Killester and died in 1668 in Limerick. So the question is really, is it possible that this first or second, rather in the order I presented them, man was in possession of the lands and maybe an older house at Killester, which was then rebuilt by his son? We don't know for certain, but we do have reference to a judgment in 1681, which divided Chidley Coote's property, the deceased Chidley Coote of Killester, County Dublin, and Mount Coote, County Limerick, between his two eldest sons, Chidley Coote and Sir Philip's Coote. So we don't know for certain. Perhaps more documentation will turn up. We do know, though, that this Chidley Coote resided and died here and bequeathed the estate of Killester to his wife, Anne, but that it was still ultimately in the ownership of the Lord of Howth. So although there was a relationship with the Coote family, it was ultimately still owned by the Howths. Now, I suppose the most celebrated family associated with Killester House is the one that I'm going to turn to now. And this is the Gleedo Newcomen family. And here we can see on Taylor and Skinner's map, surveyed in 1777, a mention of Killester House. So people paid extra to have their names on the map. So this is why we have Gleedo here indicated. And you can see that this is the road going out towards Raheny. So this would be what we now know as the Howth Road today, going towards Raheny village. And all of the great and the good had their names and their properties noted on this Taylor and Skinner map. And there is his name, so we know that he paid for the excuse me, for the privilege of having one copy of this bound volume of maps. This is Sir William Gleedo Newcomen himself, and it seems likely that he came to occupy this house in the 1770s. Because although we have a lease from the 1790s, it seems that he was already in residence there and had already made improvements to the grounds by that date. We know a little bit about the Newcomen family because they were quite celebrated at the time. And of course, coming to live in Killester in the 1770s, it had become quite an attractive location to the well-to-do residents. We see advertisements for other properties in the locality. For example, one for Mr. Burton, which remarks, "It commands a beautiful and extensive prospect of the bay, Wicklow Mountains, etc., and very convenient for bathing, being but a small mile from Clontarf." So this would have been quite a scenic location. You could still look out across Dublin Bay to the mountains, and of course sea bathing, which was becoming more popular. Sea swimming, still very popular today, was another attraction of this locality. So this proximity to the fashionable delights of sea bathing was increasing the attraction of houses in the area, and some of them were also being let for the season at this time. And some other advertisements start to note as well that this house adjoins Sir William Gleedo Newcomen's domain. So that conveyed a certain cachet. So we know then that the Newcomen family are pretty celebrated and quite important to our story. Now, William Gleedo was the son of a banker, Thomas, and his wife, Teresa, who were from Castle Street in Dublin. And William became a partner in his father's private bank. He married Charlotte here on the left, who was the only child and heiress of Edward Newcomen, who had a large estate in County Longford. And when he married her, he took her name as an additional surname and the coat of arms as well. In 1781, he was created a baronet of Carrickglass, and he was an MP for County Longford in the Irish House of Commons. Now, there was some controversy about our friend because he was initially opposed to the Act of Union, but then voted in favour. And it was said that he sort of bought various privileges through his vote, because one of the benefits was that his wife was created Baroness Newcomen. And yeah, so who knows, but it seems that he benefited from voting in favour of the union. Now, his private bank was here on Castle Street, directly opposite the side of what was then the Royal Exchange and what became City Hall and is City Hall today. And this is often still known as Newcomen's Bank to this day. It became the rates office later on and has been done up recently. So Newcomen had his private bank here. He was also company secretary of the Royal Canal Company and acted as treasurer for the company. So the name of Newcomen Bridge on the Royal Canal records his involvement. Newcomen then, and this is his ultimate end in Drumcondra graveyard. But Newcomen had undertaken various improvements at Killester. We know, for example, that he constructed a new greenhouse, a peach house, grape house, a portico, new cornices and Gothic mouldings to the windows. And we also have mention of a celebrated landscape designer, John Sutherland, coming to advise on a park at Killester, which is possibly and quite likely related to improvements being undertaken at Killester Demesne as well. So the Newcomen family certainly spent a lot of money on the house and estate at Killester. We know that Newcomen had planted a lot of timber and other trees, and we also have some reference to the various fields belonging to the house, which I'll mention later on. Unfortunately, however, when William Newcomen died, William Gleedo Newcomen, his son Thomas succeeded him in business, but William was already in a lot of debt, and Thomas was also borrowing extensively and living beyond his means. So whatever the truth of the story, it is said that he, one memoir anyway, describes it, probably a muckraking one, describes how he lived alone in the bank, gloating over ingots of treasure, and he was compared to a gloomy gnome that dwells in the dark gold mine, and occasionally emerging at twilight. Whatever the truth of that account, we do know that the bank was mismanaged. There were a number of failures of private banks in Ireland in the 1790s and early 1820s again, and Newcomen's Bank collapsed in 1825. And the failure ruined the family and many clients. So in face of the scandal, Newcomen returned home and went into his office and shot himself at the age of 48. Now, there were attempts made to allay rumours about what had happened, reporting that there had been no marks of violence on his body, but it seems to be the case that he had taken his own life. And there was a great sensation in the town when the doors were closed and his death was announced, as can be seen by this newspaper article from the time. So it seems that the bank had actually been in difficulties or maybe even insolvent for the previous 25 years. Now, although Thomas was never married, in fact, he had a very long-term relationship with Harriet Holland, who had borne him 8 children, and was initially thought that they would all be left in penury. But as it turned out, in fact, the estates did yield enough when they were all sold off that they were provided for. But all of those titles then became extinct on his death, and everything was going to be sold off. And this sale then, which eventually takes place in 1831, and the list of the contents of the house give us an idea of just how lavishly it was furnished, and gives us a sense of the sort of lifestyle that would have been lived in Killester House into the early 19th century. So we hear about the household furniture, including mahogany parlour chairs, cane seat drawing room chairs, Grecian and indulging sofas, dinner, breakfast, card, sofa and work tables, pier glass and cabinets, carpets and rugs, dumb waiters, plate buckets, tea stores, 42 fine engravings by Piranesi, curtains and draperies, brass fenders and fire irons, hall chairs, an 8-day clock, a richly carved and gilt picture frame, and the entire furniture for 11 bedrooms. And again, this gives us an idea of the size of the house, 11 bedrooms, with 4-post beds, feather beds, curled hair mattresses and bedding, mahogany wardrobes, chests of drawers, dressing tables, and so on and so forth, bidets, commodes, toilet glasses, cheval glasses or mirrors, bedroom chairs, napkins, china, glass, kitchen and dairy requisites. As you can see, the entire utensils of a brew house. So obviously they were making their own beverages there, and a bathing box on wheels. So again, referring to the proximity to the sea, that they had a bathing box, slipper baths, greenhouse plants, and numerous other articles. So it must have been quite something, that sale of the contents of Killester House. When we turn to the rest of the 19th century, we get an overall impression of what Killester was like from Lewis's Topographical Dictionary. And this describes, in the 1830s, the parish of Killester, 3 miles from Dublin, having 113 inhabitants. So you can see this was still a very rural area, quite a small population. It describes how it had these fine views that we've already mentioned, and some important dwelling houses or seats. The principal of these was Killester House, but by this stage it was the property of a General Luscombe. And it mentions here, and this is perhaps one of the earliest mentions of this idea of an abbey at Killester House, that it incorporated the remains of an old abbey, and it also mentions some of the fine trees. He also says that its gardens were formerly much admired. The hall is spacious, the reception rooms good, and the domain hastily laid out, displaying fine vistas of the bay and its southern shores, some winding wooded walks, and one straight arcade termed the Nun's Walk. So here we have an impression from Dalton, and then again from Lewis, of what the locality would have been like. It mentions also the small, the remnants of the church, which appears to be ancient, the fact that there was a public school and a Sunday school. We also have a lovely drawing of the entrance to Killester Domain from 1853, which gives us an idea of all of these trees in the locality. If we move forward to the map here, I'm going to zoom in on this map. This is a map belonging to the Howth Estate. And excuse me, you can see here Killester House at the centre of this lovely domain. We can see the Nun's Walk marked there, an ice house. There's another dwelling house which is named Killester Abbey. We have the church in ruins, and we have various nice gardens and so on. And the new Drogheda, Dublin and Drogheda Railway there towards the bottom of your image. And that's it zoomed in. We don't know exactly when the Luscombe family actually moves into the domain. It's possibly following an advertisement in the 1830s, which again gives an idea of the qualities of the house and grounds. So this was an advertisement for the residence of the late Lord Newcomen to be let, furnished or unfurnished, or to be sold. In this, the interest in this genteel residence near the 3rd milestone on the Howth Road, a few minutes' walk from the seashore, situated within a park-like fence enclosing 25 or 44 plantation acres and bounded by a belt of trees with extensive walks and shrubberies. The house has a splendid entrance hall with dining, drawing, and breakfast rooms and 10 bedrooms. We had 11 bedrooms previously, so I don't know who miscounted. And every accommodation for a family of distinction. The garden, graperies, greenhouse, and ice houses are of the very first description. There is also a compact farmyard. I think you can see the farm buildings here in this close-up, and offices of every kind. And there's the entrance that we have seen depicted previously. So you can see that the railway actually cut into the original domain and sort of passed right through the area. I'm just going to pause there for a moment. The Luscombe family, like their predecessors, the Gledo Newcomens, were wealthy and influential. So General Luscombe, seen here on the left, came into occupation of the house in the 1830s. He was Thomas Popham Luscombe, born about 1780, and married to Catherine Cook Robinson in London in 1821. And he had been promoted to Commissary General in Dublin in 1826. So they lived at Killester Manor House, formerly the residence of Viscount Newcomen, which they leased in turn from Lord Howth, and possibly until Luscombe's death. Although, as we shall see, there are some suggestions that that's not the full story. We know that at this stage, from travellers' guides, that Killester was one of the prominent houses in the locality. However, it probably paled a little into insignificance when compared with the fancy house at Marino, and therefore doesn't quite get the number of mentions one might expect. However, we see here a reference in the Postchaise Companion to Killester about a mile beyond Lord Charlemont's, Marino. And it talks about elegant gardens, a most excellent greenhouse, and a highly improved domain. And then this fine location with the great views. Another one there at the bottom from Wright's guide. Again, a beautiful domain with an excellent house. And it mentions the graperies and the pineries, pineapples being very fashionable, of course, at the time. And there are mentions in some of these also of Furry Park and of Clontarf Castle, which would have been other prominent buildings in the locality. However, if we look to the Ordnance Survey name books, which were, this is a transcription from the 1837 name book, it suggests that maybe all was not quite as well by then with Killester House, because here we see the one-storey slated house being described as being in bad order. And it's also said here that General Luscombe was living at Donnybrook and that he couldn't let the house, so he found it very difficult to find somebody to live there, which is somewhat at odds with other comments of the time. We do know, however, from other documentation of the era and the mid-19th century Griffith's valuation, the primary valuation of Ireland, gives us a good impression of what was going on in and around Killester House and Domain, which you can see there at the very centre of this map. It gives us a snapshot of land ownership and occupation. And again, Luscombe is described here as being the lessor, but the majority of the domain being under the immediate occupation of a James Wynne Esquire. You can see that the railway has pierced through the domain and occupies about 3 acres in a linear fashion. Nearby, we also have Killester Gardens, just to the south of Killester Domain. And Kirby's, who lived there, were very prominent market gardeners. So they're talking about selling tomatoes, and they had a home and foreign fruit warehouse at Upper Sackville Street, modern day O'Connell Street. So they were in business for quite some time. They had also sold fresh flowers, fruit and vegetables, and had farms here and across North County Dublin, as well as their import operations. If we move forward in time, we discover that when Thomas Popham Luscombe died in 1855, and he's buried at Mount Jerome, it seems that his sons didn't last long after him, because William Hill Luscombe and Thomas Charles Popham Luscombe, the two sons, died in 1856 and 1858 respectively. And this may be what precipitated the ultimate sale of their interests in the house and domain lands through the Landed Estates Court. And this is interesting to us because in the particulars of sale, we get a good impression of what was involved in the land, what kinds of activities were undergone, who occupied different portions, how much rent they were paying, and so on and so forth. And I won't go into it in great detail here, but it does give us some information on this land, which was at this point 117 acres, 1 rood, and 37.5 perches, being sold in 1863. But it tells us about earlier land transactions reaching back 75 years to a lease between the Earl of Howth and William Gleedo Newcomen back in 1794, and then various subsequent leases. So although most of the estate was ultimately owned by the Earl of Howth, the proprietor of Clontarf, who was John Edward Venables Vernon, also had interests in a small amount of the land. So it's kind of a complex story of ownership. The railway company also, of course, was a lessor, and we can see various details of, in addition, for example, to providing rent, there was a covenant to provide a labourer and a cart and harness for 6 days every year to the owner of the land. We don't have much information about Killester House after this point. We do have some mentions in Thom Street Directory. For example, the 1868 directory tells us that the parish of Killester now had a population of 456. But the most important thing, apparently, in Thom's eyes anyway, was the fact that the railway went through it at a depth of excavation of 36 feet, and it was crossed by an iron suspension bridge, 84 feet in span. So it seems that this railway cutting was the most remarkable thing to note about the area by the 1860s. It still was very much a rural and unspoiled area, apart from the intrusion of the railway itself. Now, the last name associated with the house at Killester is that of the Lynch family. And we do have evidence of a lease from Charles Popham Luscombe, dated April 1858, when he leased the house and the lands to William Lynch, who was a medical doctor. Now, Luscombe was to die, that was an April lease, he was to die in June of the same year. And this Roman Catholic Lynch family appears to be the last to have actually lived long-term in Killester. William Lynch had a large family. His eldest daughter married from there in 1863. His fifth son, Robert Lynch, who was a physician and surgeon, died there in 1884 at the age of 44. Lily, another daughter of Charles Edward Lynch, was married there in 1892. And so on and so forth. We can find mentions of the Lynch family in various newspaper reports of births, marriages, and deaths, effectively. But an interesting court case arose concerning Dr. William Lynch and the premises in Killester. And this is reported in the Freeman's Journal in 1867. And it sort of casts a little bit of doubt on the use to which the house was being put at this time, because the report suggests that Lynch, who ran Hartfield, private lunatic asylum in Drumcondra, that he had leased Killester House for the use of a patient at Thomas Lahiff of Galway, who had long-term dementia. And Lynch had come out under scrutiny because he had taken out a very large insurance policy, £1,000, on the life of his patient. And during the proceedings, it was admitted that Lynch had taken out the policy, but he justified it on the grounds that this was done to secure a very heavy expense which Dr. Lynch incurred in renting and supporting the establishment at Killester for this man's use. Whatever the circumstances in the 1860s, it would appear that the Lynch family occupied the main house, Killester Demesne, and Killester Hall from the 1860s through to the 1880s. And we do know that Dr. William James Lynch himself died at Killester Demesne in November 1887 at the age of 86. So by the time that Thom's Directory was published in 1889, Killester Demesne was listed as being vacant. So this is 1889. Now, it doesn't seem, oh yes, there it is in the parish map, just again showing you the Demesne House, the Nuns Walk, the farm buildings, and Killester Gardens there as well that we've previously mentioned. So not a lot of change over the decades of the 19th century, with the exception of the arrival of the railway. However, after Lynch dies, it seems that the house was never once lived in for any length of time. We see, for example, in 1903, the Irish Independent describing Lynch as the last tenant of this place, and that since his death, this beautiful house and grounds are empty. And kind of questioning that it hadn't been taken over for some sort of institutional land use. We see here in 1911 that the Howth Estate Office was advertising Killester Demesne either to be let on a long lease or to be sold. So times were changing, and the Howth Estate seems to have considered Killester Demesne no longer to have been important enough to retain in its ownership. One of the interesting sort of final phases at the Demesne is the fact that the lands here were being used for farm colony work for unemployed women from Dublin City in at least 1918, as Noel Carolyn's research has shown. And at this time, land at Fairview and surrounding Marino House was also being used for similar purposes under an initiative supported by the Vacant Land Cultivation Committee. As late as 1918, then, these photographs show us that Killester remained remarkably rural. There were only a handful of properties recorded in the street directory of that year. And the area covered extended as far as locations which would nowadays be considered to be parts of Artane. So Killester Demesne was the most significant dwelling by a long way in terms of its rateable valuation, and yet it was still vacant. So we have these images of the young women working the land, and this one in particular that I'm going to show you now is the most interesting of all, because I suspect that this corner of the building behind them is in fact an image of Killester House, the Demesne House itself. And if so, it's the latest recorded image of that building from 1918. Now, we do see various advertisements alluding to this phase in the manor or the Demesne's life. We could see advertisements for turnips and mangles in 1918, and the discussion of whether or not Dublin Corporation should actually buy out the land here at Killester. And the bottom newspaper article here discusses the fact that this could perhaps provide employment by cutting down the standing timber, which of course is that famous wood that we saw being planted way back in the 18th century. We see again the auction of the equipment associated with the farming activities at Killester, Marino and Fairview here, and a description of all of the various implements that were in use. So by 1920, we see the land is still apparently part of the estates of the St. Lawrence family of Howth. We see now the offer of grazing lands and building sites. So a change in the attitude to how this land might be used, that the land at Killester now could perhaps be used for building houses. However, things took an unfortunate turn in May of 1920. Now, the burning of houses during the revolutionary period is generally associated with the destruction of the country houses of the aristocracy and the landed gentry. But it wasn't limited to this. And in May 1920, when the Pall Mall Gazette reports this on this front page headline, Ireland's newest fire orgy, it gives a detailed accompanying article listing all of the premises which had been burned in what it terms the continuing Irish campaign of fire. And these included Kilbrittain Castle in County Cork, a farm and stockyard near Ballinsloe, Waterville Court House in County Kerry, Glendalough House, which was at the time the property of the Department of Agriculture, and in the middle of all of this, Killester House, which is described here as being the property of Dublin Corporation. And this involved, this latter involving £2,000 worth of damage. Now, it's not actually clear why Killester House was targeted, but this would be the end of an era. It was actually quite difficult to find a record in a report of the destruction of Killester House. Such was the scale of damage being undertaken at this time. So you can see it appears in a long list of many other shootings, burnings and outrages, a catalogue of outrages as the Irish Times describes it. The house then was set on fire and completely destroyed. We don't know exactly why it was targeted, although the Irish Times, which lists this and events across the country ranging from the destruction of letterboxes and cattle drives to thefts, armed raids and attacks upon individuals, shootings, burnings. This brief paragraph suggests that the house was unoccupied. It was destroyed to prevent the military from taking it over. Whether or not there was any truth to that story, the extent of the damage was £2,000, and such was the extent of the damage that it was never rebuilt. All traces would subsequently be removed. Some elements were salvaged and brought to Howth Castle, as we shall see. The ruins that remained must have been quite dangerous, because I came across this sad story of a little boy who was following a little goat into the ruin, and part of the walls gave way. He fell and eventually died as a result of his injuries. So we know that what was left of the domain was either salvaged and brought to Howth Castle or ploughed into the ground underneath that green area beside the Legion Hall, modern day Legion Hall. So all that survives above ground is the rather unusual street name, Demesne. Now, aside from the ice house, which lay under the shade of the trees in a corner of the estate that the new veterans who moved in there later called the woods, and a tree-lined walk surrounding the new houses which were built for ex-servicemen, there was very little of the house surviving, as we said. And really until about 3 years ago, little could be remembered about the house. But when Howth Castle came up for sale recently, and its contents were sold, we also see various pieces of stone, slate, sections of fireplaces, dismantled chimney pieces, and so on, which had come from Killester House and had been salvaged. And indeed, we also see the original entrance gates in a distressed condition. Those fine gates that we saw in the McPartland image from much earlier in the talk. So these are the last remnants of Killester House. The final chapter, really, in a remarkable story and a very long running story running over many centuries of Killester. So I hope you've enjoyed this brief run through some of the highlights and lowlights indeed of the story of Killester. Thank you very much.